Welcome to The Thinking Tree, a podcast to help believers renew their minds and reform their hearts. I'm Adam Sanchez.
And I'm Jeff No.
And today we are talking about missions. All right, we're back with another episode of The Thinking Tree, and today we are talking about missions. A very light topic that has not been hotly debated for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah.
We wanted to talk about this because it is an important topic, even on the heels of actually this year's TMAI conference, Masters Academy International. They put out a book on biblical missions. It's supposed to be the textbook now on biblical missions. And so I've been working my way through it, going through it, and I appreciate many components I've been reading so far. But I think it is a difficult topic, difficult subject matter, because there's a lot that we bring into this. We bring in how we were raised in a church.
Yep.
We bring in what we are passionate or zealous about. Some of us, we bring in our own conversion testimony. You know, what occurred that God used to bring us unto salvation in time and space. There's a lot that's kind of wrapped up in our understanding of missions. So I wanted to take a little bit of time on a couple of these episodes and emphasize a biblical position on missions that is not trying to eliminate, but really trying to focus the church's attention. What should we be most focused on so we don't get so distracted, by so many things, and then talk about some of the nuances of, what really the implications really of a biblical position on missions. So I'm going to use one of your phrases that you said in one of our previous episodes that, what kind of missions should we be pursuing? Biblical missions. You would think that was planned. It wasn't. That was just normal.
Oh, wait. Are you saying that the Bible actually talks about this? Like there's a missions in the New Testament?
It seems to be.
It seems like there's a book called Acts.
The Acts of the Apostles was very clear about what church planning looked like. Oh, and I kind of gave it away right there. What missions is.
Yeah.
AKA.
Church planting.
Church planting. The raising up of faithful believers all around the world. Here's why I think this is important. There's been a lot of work in modern missions that is different from, let's say, 19th century missions movement.
Yes,
where we had guys like William Carey and Judson going to parts of the world who were very gifted linguistically, who focused on Bible translation for the sake of building up then believers so they can hear the word, right? Because how will they know unless they hear?
Right.
So they're focusing on getting the Bible in their own language that they can read, and then from there being able to raise disciples and build up churches. And that was what was normal or still hard and wasn't accepted actually, even in their day. Many of their own churches didn't support them well,
right.
And didn't appreciate the work. But guys who were steadfast in that. Fast forward to today, where I think in the last 20-ish, 30 years, there's been a large catch-all for what missions could be. And so without diving into every one of those yet, I wanted to focus, well, what does the Bible say about missions?
Yeah.
Because I don't think the Bible is silent about these things. So as a church history nerd...
Thank you.
Yeah, as a church history nerd, the church starts with a history.
It does.
And you mentioned the book of Acts.
Yeah.
And so as we look at the book of Acts, there are, I think, several things to consider in terms of implications for church dynamics. The first of which is going to be elders traveling to raise up believers.
Yes.
Isn't that interesting? Elders and apostles, we can get a little into that.
Right.
But we have biblically, whether we term it trained or qualified, might be a good word.
Yeah.
Qualified.
Even recognized by churches. Yes.
Sent out for the sake of raising up churches and believers.
Yes. Yes. And those guys being recognized as going out on behalf of Jesus and going into unreached places and beginning to preach the gospel and eventually gathering a group of people who have committed to Christ, planting a church, supporting it with teaching, and establishing local elders. And I think that's when you talk about the 19th century models, it feels so antiquated to us, but at the time it was really the only way to do it. And it was, so you had these guys from Europe going into these third world countries, risking their life, very dangerous, right? A lot of them lost family members, kids, wives, all kinds of things, killed in the mission field, all that stuff. But the whole mission depended on them. And they figured they would go and stay there for life. But when you look at the Bible, what you see is Paul traveling and not spending a lot of time in one place. It's very interesting. What he wants to do is raise up believers in those native places and start planting churches and establishing elders, and then moving on, but coming back to follow up. Constantly making sure that the teaching is correct, that elders are being established, but constantly writing back or sending somebody else to go check on them. But the idea, I think, that has changed quite a bit is the mission, and you can correct me because you're more of an expert on this than I am. Back in the days of William Carey, it was everything depended on Carey's, steadfastness in that mission. Whereas what's happening here is you have the native population having to be raised up and elders established from among that population. They've got to be, in other words, they've got to teach themselves, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is important to note some of the differences between what we see in Acts in the New Testament, in the very beginning of the New Testament, versus what we've seen in the last couple hundred years. For one of those things, we talk about least reached people, unreached people.
Yeah.
And when Paul and the disciples are going out, they're actually not going out to languages that they didn't understand.
True.
So that's one distinction with like a guy like Carey who went to India. And needed to take on a new language and then to translate that. Very interesting, bit of work there. Whereas Paul spoke multiple languages. He spoke Greek. He went to Greek provinces.
Right.
And then there's the nuance too of they also sought to not just the Gentiles, but to the former Jews as well.
Right.
And so there was a duality of ministry to people who had an Old Testament background of understanding to some degree. We might today we have our Bible Belt, nominal Christian. That's kind of a trope that is used today. But cultural Christianity kind of thing. There were cultural Jews, maybe not practicing, but cultural Jews, and then there were Gentiles.
Right.
Gentiles who came from Hellenistic background and not monotheists, but multi-deistic worshipers. But there was a commonality of culture and language that Paul and the early disciples had in the bulk of what they were doing in terms of their ministry. So that's one nuance, in what they're bringing.
Right.
And I think another nuance within that, and you're pointing it out, is they're being sent by local congregations to go to raise up, to build up a local congregation, and then to come back.
Right.
Or move on to another city, and then to have correspondence, whether they're going to come and visit for a time or they send these circular letters to be encouragements. It's a very interesting time. And here's my, I would give this one thought to people who are trying to study the nature of modern missions in comparison to the book of Acts and the biblical model is you can't have a one-for-one of exactly what happened in the New Testament is exactly what we do today because of the nuance of time and space and culture. So there's enough nuance. It can't be one for one, but principles I think are very clear in the New Testament model. The principles of that New Testament model where you have trained individuals who go and to establish teachers and leaders in the church is critical.
Right.
I think that's a misstep today often that's made where you have individuals who go out to do missions work that is not for the sake of raising up church leaders, which requires believing at the base level. So discipleship, so evangelism first, then discipleship, but discipling to a point, really discipling to be leaders.
Yeah,
I mean that's key. That's huge, and that's a biblical model.
Right. So that you can move on, basically.
Exactly, because you have to be able to hand it off.
Right.
You can't expect to stay there forever.
Right.
That's something that's different. Even I think changed in the Carey and Judson days. It changed where they said, okay, I got to move away and I'm going to stay there forever. And, and that is what it is until I die.
Right.
I'm not saying that's sinful. I'm just saying that it's different than the New Testament model that we see in Acts because it was more temporal. Here's one of the encouragements that I see in the New Testament model. What you see is these disciples, including Paul, they're raising up church leaders who will also raise up church leaders.
Right.
They're raising up elders, they're raising up deacons who will disciple their own people and then go on to disciple further out people.
Right.
I think that's a brilliant model that Christ has given to the church. I don't know how often people use that today. And so that's one critique I would give for today is I think often we focus on going as far as we can. And I think there's a biblical precedent for going to adjacent places that can reach. And I think that's what we see in the New Testament, in Acts.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, where's the first place that Paul goes?
Is this a question for me? Are you?
Well, I mean,
because I'm in.
he goes right into Asia Minor.
Yeah, right here in Acts 14.
I mean, he doesn't. In other words, he doesn't sail straight to Rome,
Right.
Or even to Greece. He goes to Asia Minor, which
Yeah.
is the adjacent continent, so
Yes.
to speak.
Which has a great reach across the Roman Empire.
Correct. And then goes from there, and then moves on. He's the Galatian, Pisidian Antioch, and the Galatian churches, and then he's like, I'll go up to Troas, and then I'm sailing across the Aegean Sea. But by then, he's already planted all these churches behind him.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Along the way, and what it seems to be is that they would then go and have reach.
Yeah.
Further into their various regions.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that's the only way.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good model. I think that's a good baseline to start with. So describing this, right? Acts 14, we're picking up here. They had just gone from Lystra and Antioch, right? And they're returning in Acts 14. And the description, I think, is very important in Acts 14:22. This is the purpose. They're strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith. What does that sound like? Hebrews 10.
Yeah.
Right? And saying, through many afflictions, we must enter the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And you can easily look past this and just focus on the geography, which is important. The geography is important to understand the day.
It's cultural too, though.
Yes.
I mean, so for example, in Asia Minor culture, so in Laodicea, there's a better chance that you're going to be able to plant a church in Hierapolis than going across over to Corinth, right?
Yeah, it does matter.
Because
The
culture
geography
matters.
It does, because there's similarities there.
Right.
I just don't want to miss the purpose.
Right.
Of why they were going. And I think that's what we can sometimes do when we're just thinking through like, oh, okay, I want to understand Paul's movements, which I do. I mean, it's important.
Yeah.
We should understand the geography. And with the geography, maps. We love maps, right? I was teasing you. I'm like, where's the map? Let's get more maps. But it's also important to see what they're doing. You're strengthening the souls, continuing to encourage them in the faith. And the reality is it's through these afflictions where they're being really sanctified, that progressive sanctification. And then that key verse in verse 23, they had appointed elders in every church. That seems to be the biblical model. If there's one biblical model for missions that is most clear, it is the appointment of elders, which requires evangelism and discipleship and all of Titus 2, right? To raise up believers to be mature in the faith, Ephesians 4, Colossians chapter 1, so that they can walk faithfully and then encourage others to do the same. So if I were to make a biblical case, I would say the biblical case for missions is church planting.
Right.
The raising up of elders, appointing of elders so that they can lead local churches and who can raise up the next generation, who will also then send out and then raise up more churches. Like that seems to be the biblical model that I see in Acts.
I agree. I'm with you, man.
Wow.
I like it.
That was quick.
That was easy. That was easy. Yeah, no, I agree. I just think today we make it so hard. We make it harder than it has to be because we have visions of grandeur when honestly, the mission field is everywhere. And we can make it really hard on ourselves or not. And it's interesting the way I think the geography and the culture, all those things matter.
Yeah.
But I'm just not sure we take that into consideration as much as we should today.
Yeah. If I were to make one appeal, to the listeners they're thinking through, because it might sound like I'm not a fan of missions. I work in Africa.
That's
so
right.
Just to clarify, I'm a huge fan of missions and church planting and bringing the gospel to the nations and to the least, to the least of all. But within that, I think it does matter how we approach it And so even in line with my work, we work with local churches.
Yeah.
We're not an organization who we're focused on bringing the gospel, though we're faithful Christians. We're focused on raising up churches, and we're not the church planters, but helping to raise up the testimony of faithful churches to bring the gospel in word and deed.
Right.
That's the emphasis. So the emphasis is not that Children's Hunger Fund becomes famous. We
Right.
want to make Christ famous.
Right.
We want his name to go forth through the mouths and through the actions of faithful local churches. So there is missions opportunities everywhere. Or there
Right.
are, to use proper English. There are missions opportunities everywhere. I think we often focus on big things.
Yeah.
But the regular things matter. That's qualifications. We were talking about this a few episodes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Qualifications, why do they matter so much for elders and deacons? Because if they're not faithful in the home,
Right.
how can they be faithful in the church?
Right.
I'd say the same about missionaries. If they're not faithful in the small things, how can they be faithful in the big things when they're far away from accountability and they're far away from
When it's harder.
right
Yeah.
when all the testing, the affliction is what we read about comes upon. So those things do matter. Being faithful in the small things, and it's a principle that we see Jesus teach about. Right.
Right.
Being faithful with little, you can be faithful with much. Not a promise that you will be given much, but the principle that if
Yeah.
you can be faithful with little, you can be entrusted with more.
We have a tendency to think we look purely at zeal and not at what you just described, which is, no, we're good church members. We're faithful in this little thing here at home. The zeal's got to be there, obviously,
Yeah.
but it can't just be, well, I'm really excited to go to XYZ country. And I think churches need to pay more attention to that. Just as we qualify leaders, we should qualify missionaries that go out and to say, yeah, they're fully equipped, they're ready. This is a couple that, Lord willing, is going to be successful in the field that they've chosen, because it makes sense on a practical level. The excitement and zeal is there. We feel like this is God's calling. They've proved themselves faithful. Let's go.
Yeah. I heard a very famous pastor. I was having dinner with him in East Africa. I won't name drop.
Oh, name drop. Come on.
I don't want to
No,
name drop.
Gosh.
He's preached to shepherds before. I'll leave it at that.
Vodi.
He's African.
Oh, okay.
So I've narrowed it down.
Conrad.
So he said the best missionaries
Yeah.
were fantastic church members.
And
He's saying that even from within Zambia. Within Zambia, because they plant a lot of church. They've planted a lot of churches over the years. He said the best missionaries, the best
that
church
makes
planters
sense.
are fantastic church members.
Yeah.
And what they love to do is when they go to plant a church, they don't just send the guy and his wife. They don't just send the pastor. They send as many people as they can
Right.
with them to go plant.
Right.
Because they want faithful believers, even if they don't have, a title, an authority role, but just faithful believers to walk alongside others.
Yeah.
And so I look at something like that and I think, man, you talk about least reach. I mean, these areas of Zambia, and I'm just picking one country,
Yeah.
in there. We could pick any number of countries. But these places that are in northern Zambia, Copperbelt areas where we get all of our metals from our phones. China has a bunch of, they dig a lot through Africa to get all the rare earth metals. But these places are untouched. And yet there are faithful Christians that are coming from this tiny church in Lusaka that have believers alongside them who are just living out daily faithfulness, discipling. That some of them are nurses and some of them are accountants if they're in a main city. If they're not in a main city, then they're farmers, and they're just living hand to mouth every single day.
Right.
But seeking to bring the gospel to bear.
Right.
That seems to be the normal missionary work, is building up the church. So you need elders. You need to appoint elders. You're building up the church because that's how you have impact according to God. That's what I see in the New Testament.
Right. Well, and if you're doing it His way, He's going to bless that effort, right? And then we trust Him for the results.
Amen.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure I just raised a ton of questions.
Sure.
With that.
Sure you did.
So in advance of answering questions, we're going to take on a part 2.
Adam at oakhillbible.com.
.org?
.com.
.com. Oh, okay, just checking. We're going to take on a part 2 for this one to talk about some nuanced questions.
Okay.
So we'll dig into that. But we pray this episode has helped to encourage your hearts, and we'll see you next time on The Thinking Tree.